They said the impact came out of nowhere. Metal twisted, glass shattered, time split open. But what if the crash wasn't the beginning? What if it was the reveal? I remember the sound of sirens, the smell of burnt air, and one message glowing on my cracked phone screen. "Can't this wait? We're busy." Those 4 words carved through the morphine haze like a command from something older than family. In that moment I understood. Love can be programmed to obey hierarchy, not heart. My father wasn't cruel. He was conditioned. And that's the part no one tells you. Our first tyrants are not kings or priests, but those who teach us to mistake neglect for discipline. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling lights flickering like interrogation lamps, I realized I'd stumbled into a truth that civilizations have buried under marble and scripture. Every empire, every church, every corporation has perfected the same reflex: make people apologize for needing help. It starts in the family, then blooms into nations. Control dressed as care, obedience branded as love. When the doctors asked for parental consent, I laughed, a hollow, broken sound, because what they really wanted was permission to save me from the same authority that once promised to protect me. I was watching a ritual older than history repeat itself, a system choosing convenience over compassion. And in that ritual I saw the pattern of every forgotten civilization that fell while pretending to rise. You may think this is just one girl's tragedy, but it's the same design that built the pyramids on silence and the temples on fear. We have always mistaken control for order, and we call it family, so the lie feels holy. The night I survived, I understood something dangerous. My accident was not random. It was initiation, the moment the mask of ordinary life cracked open just wide enough for me to see the machinery underneath. From that day on, I stopped asking why they didn't come. I started asking who taught them not to. Hospitals are strange temples. They hum with the sound of machines pretending to understand life, while the walls whisper the price of belonging. When I woke days later, the nurses smiled the way statues do, polite, empty, efficient. I asked if my father had called. They said he sent paperwork, the new scripture, sign here, confirm, release, the same ritual humanity performs every day without reading the fine print of its own soul. That's when I began to see it. How every signature we give to authority, every moment we choose silence over truth, stitches another thread into the web. My father didn't invent the neglect that nearly killed me. He inherited it, passed down like a bloodline of obedience, stretching back to the first man who learned that power is easier to maintain when people call it love. Think about it. From childhood, we are trained to equate approval with survival. We learn to perform pain quietly so we don't cause trouble. That's how the machinery stays hidden. It doesn't chain your body, it programs your loyalty. When I looked at those documents, I realized they weren't about my recovery. They were about compliance, a ritual of signatures that keeps the illusion running. Hospitals need patience. Families need roles. Society needs someone to kneel first, so the rest remember how. I began tracing the pattern backward, from the clipboard to the ward, from the ward to the law, from the law to the throne of memory itself. And everywhere I looked, I found the same seal. 3 invisible letters pressed into every era of history, OBEY, the oldest language in the world, written not in ink, but in fear. That night, when the ward fell silent and only the machines breathed beside me, I made a vow, not of revenge, but of awakening. If obedience was my inheritance, I would end the bloodline, not by rebellion, but by remembering, because memory, once awakened, is the one thing authority cannot rewrite. They tell us that history began with fire, but that's a lie of convenience. History began with permission. The first time one human bowed to another and called it peace, every empire after that only perfected the gesture. When I was strong enough to walk again, I followed the hum that lived behind the hospital walls. It led me to an old archive room, a place that smelled of dust and resignation. Boxes stacked like tombs, files filled with lives reduced to codes. I read until the pages blurred, and somewhere between a consent form and a coronation decree from centuries ago, I saw the same handwriting, different ink, same pattern. The voices in the paper weren't shouting. They were whispering a rhythm that had guided rulers and families alike. Keep them busy. Keep them waiting. Tell them it's for their own good. And I understood my father's text wasn't just his. It was a modern translation of that ancient rhythm. I imagined the first council that discovered this law of control. They learned that you don't need chains if you can teach a man to chain himself. You don't need walls if he believes the world beyond them is dangerous. You don't need gods if guilt will do the same work. As I read, the shelves seemed to breathe. The air thickened. For a moment I felt I wasn't in a hospital archive, but in the echo of every forgotten temple where power learned to hide behind mercy. I realized the system isn't one thing. It's a pattern of belief, a design written into lullabies, traditions, and promises. It tells fathers to stay busy, mothers to stay silent, and children to earn the right to be seen. That night I left the archive with nothing but a trembling truth. The accident had cracked the surface, but this pattern was the abyss beneath it, and once you've seen the abyss, you can't go back to pretending it's a shadow. The world outside the hospital seemed ordinary, but only to those who had never seen the undercurrent. I had seen it now, the invisible loom weaving obedience into every life. It begins in classrooms, where curiosity is measured in grades and compliance is rewarded like a medal. It spreads into workplaces, where ambition is harnessed, not liberated, and every promotion is a contract of silent agreement. Even love, I realized, is a ledger of concessions, the quiet surrender of needs, the unspoken promise to not disturb the machinery. I watched families walking through parks, friends laughing in cafes, and I could see the chains in the air, thin, nearly invisible, yet unbreakable until someone wakes. And I understood why my father's message had cut so deeply. It wasn't cruelty, it was pattern recognition. He had been trained to see emergencies as inconvenient, to prioritize appearances over essence, to measure love in transactions, not truth. And this was the echo of 1,000 civilizations, stretching back to rulers who built palaces on fear and priests who built altars on obedience. That night I traced it further: rituals, laws, folklore, even bedtime stories. Every story taught the same lesson: obey first, question later, and accept delay as sacred. It is the oldest lesson in the world, control disguised as care. I saw kings whisper it to children, prophets murmur it in temples, merchants brand it into contracts. And I realized that my accident was a key. It unlocked the lens to see these truths, the architecture of influence hiding in plain sight, shaping millions who thought they were free. I remember standing on a street corner as the city lights flickered. The noise was ordinary, but I heard the rhythm behind it, the subtle insistence to wait, to comply, to accept delay as destiny. I felt rage, yes, but also awe. This system was vast, older than any person alive, and yet it was fragile. Because every pattern, no matter how deeply encoded, has a crack, I began to see mine. The crack that began the day my father's words reached me. A simple text, 4 words, and the machinery trembled. It was a whisper that said, "Even the oldest patterns are not invincible." And in that moment, I knew that the journey ahead would demand courage beyond fear, knowledge beyond schooling, and the willingness to walk alone into the hidden corridors of human conditioning. The next morning I returned to the hospital, not as a patient, but as a witness. I walked the halls slowly, listening to the rhythms of bureaucracy, each beep of a monitor, each shuffle of nurses' shoes, each whispered instruction. Everything was part of a choreography I had never noticed before. I saw how delay became control, how forms, permissions, and schedules acted as gates. Every person obeyed without question, not because they were afraid of punishment, but because they had been trained to accept it as inevitable. I began tracing the lineage of these behaviors, imagining a chain stretching backward through time. The scribes of ancient courts, the priests of forgotten temples, the keepers of laws long erased. They had all discovered the same trick: structure obedience as virtue, and the obedient will guard their chains. I realized that the hospital, the place meant to heal, was not immune. It was a mirror of civilization itself, order maintained by shaping consent, not by force. And I saw my father again, standing at the threshold of that mirror, a man conditioned to see love as inconvenience. The documents he sent, the forms he signed, were not just paperwork. They were a ritual of reinforcement, a ceremony of compliance performed in the name of care. I could feel the weight of centuries pressing against every signature. I understood something dangerous. Institutions do not fail because people are cruel. They succeed because people accept their small role in the machinery, and in doing so forget how to see the cracks. I walked into the waiting room and observed quietly. Patients and families shuffled like shadows along a preordained path. No one questioned the delays, the instructions, the silent hierarchy. The machinery was invisible yet omnipresent. It told you what to value, when to move, whom to trust. And all the while it whispered a single eternal command: obey first, survive later, question never. I pressed my hand to the cold wall, feeling the pulse of history beneath it. Every civilization that rose, every empire that fell, had left the same imprint. The system was neither new nor unique. It was ancestral, and I understood why my father's text had felt like a blade through my chest. It was the echo of a structure older than any memory, a pattern of obedience passed down like a silent inheritance. The real danger, I realized, was not in the machinery itself, but in the way it hides in plain sight, so familiar, so natural that most never notice the hand guiding them. And in that quiet revelation, I began to see my path, to trace every shadow, to map every rule, to walk deliberately into the hidden architecture of control, until nothing in my world or theirs remained unquestioned. I began to see the invisible patterns in the way people obey, long before any accident or tragedy. From the earliest lullabies to the first school lessons, humanity had been conditioned to respond to authority without question. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a tone in the voice, a pause in the instruction, a reward for compliance. Centuries of refinement had produced a system so precise that no chains were necessary. The mind would lock itself in willingly. I traced it back to ancient techniques, rituals designed to bend human behavior without breaking the body, priests who whispered rules of shame into children, kings who ordered ceremonies of waiting, teaching patience as loyalty, merchants who measured obedience in coins and favors, weaving dependency into daily life. Even medicine, I realized, had its role, forcing consent, scheduling life, structuring care into a web of silent compliance. All these strands converged into a single, continuous thread, the subtle training of the mind to obey. And in the hospital, I saw it mirrored perfectly. The forms, the paperwork, the constant wait. These were modern instruments of the same age-old art. Every "we're busy" message, every delay, every instruction framed as protection, was a lesson in submission. I understood something terrifying. No one had to give the order. The system instructed itself, because humans had been conditioned to follow it automatically. I began to examine my own reflexes. I realized how many times I had waited unnecessarily, how many times I had accepted delay as natural, how many times I had deferred my truth in favor of convenience. It wasn't just my father or my accident. It was the culmination of countless patterns stretching back through generations. And those patterns were alive. They shaped bodies, minds, and souls without consent. And yet, like any living system, they could be disrupted. I understood then that knowledge itself was a weapon. Not just any knowledge, but the kind that exposes the invisible gears of obedience. Once you see them, you cannot unsee them. Once you recognize the rhythm of control, every polite delay, every enforced waiting room, every courteous dismissal is a mirror reflecting a far older truth. That night, I closed my eyes and whispered the first command to myself. I will see the unseen, and I will not obey by default. It was the beginning of something dangerous and liberating. The first act of rebellion is always silent, yet it resonates across time, echoing through the patterns that once bound you. By now, you may feel it too. The subtle tug at your own mind, the silent chains that guide your decisions without your notice. This isn't just a story about one girl, or one father, or an accident. It is about the architecture of obedience that has shaped every human life since the first act of submission. And now I want you to participate in this awakening, not with words that entertain, but with words that anchor a shift inside you. I want you to comment a single symbolic phrase, twice, on this video. Write it down, speak it in your mind, let it echo. Type these words, I see the unseen. And then repeat it twice. Let it imprint on your awareness. This is not a mantra. It is a key. It is the first act of taking ownership of your mind, of recognizing the machinery that has shaped your obedience and choosing to step beyond it. Because once you see the patterns, you cannot unsee them. Once you recognize the rhythm of delay, the whispers of authority, the subtle measures of control, you begin to understand how deeply humans are trained to obey without question. And yet this knowledge is dangerous. It is dangerous because it can change you forever. Once awakened, you cannot go back to blind acceptance. You will see the pauses, the approvals, the structured silences, and you will understand their purpose. The machinery surrounds us everywhere, in schools, in workplaces, in families. The same invisible rules that told my father to wait, to delay, to dismiss, live inside you, inside me, inside every social contract we take for granted. But here is the secret. Consciousness is the first fracture in the system. Every observation, every recognition, every act of awareness begins to weaken the patterns that demand compliance. So as you type those words, I see the unseen. Twice, feel it settle inside you. Feel the recognition ripple across your mind. You are no longer just a witness. You are beginning to become the observer, the disruptor, the one who understands the hidden architecture behind polite delays, silent obedience, and the ritual of waiting. And remember this, the moment you awaken to the machinery of control is the moment your life is no longer optional for others. You begin to reclaim time, authority, and attention that was quietly taken from you. The system will notice. The system will resist, but for the first time you are awake. We are ready to move to Section 8, where Elaine begins tracing the ancient roots of delay and obedience, from temple rituals to medieval courts, revealing how these mechanisms became embedded in the modern world. I began to trace the lineage of the forces that shaped my father's behavior, and, unknowingly, mine. It was not a simple story. It stretched back millennia into civilizations long forgotten, into temples and courts where obedience was first written into the bones of society. In ancient temples, priests taught patience as devotion. Children learned that waiting was holy, that delay purified the mind, that submission was sacred. Every ritual, every ceremony, every moment of enforced stillness was a lesson, to follow without question, to accept postponement as virtue. And those lessons did not disappear. They were encoded into law, habit, and culture, carried forward through time like a hidden virus. In medieval courts, kings perfected the same art. Petitions went unanswered for weeks. Approvals arrived only after meticulous adherence to ritual. The nobility watched carefully, taking note of who waited gracefully and who rebelled, who obeyed and who questioned. Those who questioned too soon were cast out, forgotten, or broken. The lesson was clear. Control did not need violence. It only needed structure, delay, and the illusion of choice. I saw the pattern again in the modern world. Hospitals, corporations, governments, everywhere, the same rhythm persisted. Forms, schedules, instructions, all designed to teach compliance, to make waiting natural, to normalize submission. It was a system older than memory, more insidious than any command shouted aloud. And my father's text, "Can't this wait, we're busy," was simply the modern echo of that ancient pattern, a whisper of control disguised as concern. The deeper I went, the more I realized this knowledge was dangerous, not because it threatened others, but because it threatened the obedient self. Once you see how deeply these forces run, you cannot remain passive. Every delay becomes a question, every polite dismissal becomes a mirror, every act of obedience becomes a choice to confront or conform, and I understood the truth that few ever speak aloud. Civilizations rise and fall not because of wars or plagues, but because obedience is taught, unquestioned. Every great empire relied on humans willing to wait, defer, and accept postponement as destiny, and every subtle act of awakening, a question asked too soon, a refusal to wait, has the power to fracture the entire system. That night I walked under the moonlight, feeling the weight of thousands of years pressing down, and I realized the accident was not just my initiation, it was the lens through which I would see the hidden rhythms of all human control, from the altar to the office, from the palace to the home. The modern world is a palace of invisible chains. Not bars, not swords, not open threats, but schedules, forms, approvals, and polite refusals. I began to see them everywhere. In classrooms, where questions were filtered, in workplaces, where initiatives were delayed, in families, where needs were politely postponed. Every system teaches the same rhythm: wait, comply, defer, obey. And if you do it well, you are praised. If you resist, you are punished. Not overtly, but through omission, silence, exclusion. I traced it in my own life. Every time I waited for someone's attention, their approval, or their recognition, I was practicing obedience. Every time I deferred my own need because someone else's schedule seemed more important, I reinforced the pattern. And suddenly, my father's text, "Can't this wait? We're busy," was not a personal betrayal. It was a lesson delivered with millennia of refinement. It was a whisper of the system saying, obedience is more valuable than urgency, conformity more valuable than care. I began mapping the tools of mod. Earn compliance, calendars that control attention, meetings that consume time, emails that demand acknowledgement, the social norms that praise patience while discouraging confrontation, even gratitude itself. "Thank you for waiting" is a ritual of conditioning, a subtle reminder that compliance is virtue. Every busy message, every polite delay, every expectation of patience is a brick in the invisible wall that surrounds our minds. And yet, like any pattern, cracks appear where awareness exists. I began testing them, small rebellions at first, asking questions before permission, prioritizing my needs instead of waiting, seeing delays for what they were. Each act illuminated the structure behind the obedience. The machinery is vast but fragile. It does not crumble with force, it bends with consciousness. I understood that most people never notice because it has been normalized for so long. You grow up believing the system is benevolent, that delays are natural, that waiting is proof of respect. But when you begin to see the design, everything changes. You no longer wait passively. You no longer obey by default. You begin to navigate, disrupt, and reclaim the authority over your own life that centuries of ritual, habit, and culture tried to absorb from you. And in that realization, I felt something both terrifying and liberating. I was no longer just a witness. I was an awakened participant, a cartographer of the invisible architecture that governs human obedience. And with awareness came responsibility. The dangerous responsibility to choose differently, to act consciously, and to refuse the automatic rhythm that had trapped my father, my generation, and so many before me. Trauma is a teacher most people fear. It does not shout. It does not demand attention. It whispers in the body, echoes in the mind, and leaves patterns in behavior that are invisible until you know how to see them. My accident was not just a physical event. It was an initiation into awareness, a key that unlocked the machinery of control my father and countless others had inherited and perpetuated. I began to see the connection between my personal pain and the vast networks of societal conditioning. Every rule, every polite delay, every enforced waiting period mirrors the ways trauma teaches obedience. Societies do not invent compliance. They cultivate it through repetition, expectation, and subtle enforcement, and trauma, when unexamined, strengthens that architecture. The lessons of waiting, the lessons of deferral, the lessons of quiet suffering. They echo through families, institutions, and generations. I thought of my father again. He had been trained unknowingly by the same invisible hands that trained me. His insistence on "we're busy" was a reflex, a habit rooted in centuries of inherited patterns, a legacy of obedience disguised as efficiency, as care, as normality. And the irony was inescapable. The very system that shaped him had blinded him to my suffering. I realized then that my trauma was not just personal. It was an invitation to perceive the invisible rules governing human life, from the home to the state, from the smallest ritual to the largest institution. Every act of compliance became a story of ancestral instruction. Every delay became a lesson in submission. Every polite refusal became a mirror reflecting centuries of hidden authority. And as I traced the lineage of these lessons, I understood something crucial. Trauma alone does not break patterns. It awakens awareness, but only if you choose to see it is a dangerous choice. To recognize the forces shaping your mind is to step into a battlefield most never notice. You see the chains where others see freedom, the gates where others see opportunity, the rituals where others see civility. And yet, within that danger lies liberation, because awareness is the first fracture in the system. The moment you see the mechanisms, you have the chance to saint outside them, to refuse the inherited patterns, to reclaim the authority over your own life. By the time I left the hospital that night, I was no longer the same person who had read a single text message. I had crossed a threshold. The patterns were no longer invisible. The machinery was no longer unquestioned. And I understood that the real work had only just begun. The conscious act of breaking free piece by piece, moment by moment. 3 weeks after the accident, I walked into my father's study carrying the papers, not just legal forms, not just signatures, but the embodiment of every realization I had gathered in those long nights of observation. Each sheet was a testament to awareness, a map of the machinery, a challenge to the invisible rhythms that had governed our lives. They were small, ordinary, yet deadly in their implications. Knowledge was now a weapon, and I was armed. I laid them on the desk, and for the first time, I saw hesitation cross my father's face. It wasn't fear of law, or anger, or betrayal. It was the moment a man encounters the patterns he himself perpetuated. The delay, the polite refusal, the conditioned "we're busy," all of it was laid bare in front of him, reflected in the deliberate weight of my gaze and the certainty in my hands. I realized then something profound. Authority, no matter how familiar, falters in the presence of clarity. The machinery of obedience trembles when confronted not by force, but by awareness. The papers were symbolic, yes, but they carried a deeper truth. Every form, every signature, every compliance ritual we had performed for decades could now be seen as a choice. And when you recognize that, the power dynamic shifts. You do not need violence to reclaim authority. You only need to show the system that its patterns are visible, understood, and no longer automatic. I watched as he read, line by line. The room grew quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I realized this moment echoed across history. The first time a subordinate sees the invisible chains, the first time awareness confronts ritual, the first time observation fractures control, the first time obedience meets comprehension. And it hit me. The accident, the text, the waiting room, the hospital corridors, the nights tracing invisible patterns, they had all led to this singular confrontation. Not a battle of anger, but a collision of understanding. The papers were not simply evidence, they were mirrors. They reflected the system, the inheritance, the conditioning. And once reflected, no one can pretend it is invisible. That day I understood the power of recognition, the power of conscious observation, the power of reclaiming authority without needing to destroy, without needing to punish. And in that moment I realized that what I held in my hands was not just a legal instrument, but the key to rewriting the patterns that had controlled my father, myself, and generations before us. The moment the papers were laid down, I realized something far more profound than any legal victory. I had shifted, not the world around me, not my father, not the hospital or the forms, but myself. The act of confronting the machinery of obedience awakened a clarity I had never known. I saw the invisible threads that had guided my life, my decisions, my expectations of others, and for the first time I understood them as choices, not inevitabilities. Transformation is not loud. It is a subtle, seismic shift in perception. It begins in the mind and spreads to the body, reshaping the way you hold space, the way you wait, or refuse to wait. It alters the way you respond to delay, dismissal, and authority. It is dangerous because it cannot be reversed once truly felt. And yet it is liberating because it reveals that the chains you believed bound you were only ever as strong as your unawareness. I could feel the patterns dissolving inside me, slowly but unmistakably. Where I deferred, I now questioned. Where I once obeyed reflexively, I now paused. Where I once accepted polite refusals as natural, I now recognized them as echoes of ancient systems, waiting to be challenged. This awareness created a new landscape, one where observation, intention, and action aligned, one where power was no longer inherited or imposed, but reclaimed. I turned to my father and saw a reflection of what many never see, the machinery of control even within those we love. He had acted out of habit, but the reflection in my actions confronted him with his own conditioning. And that confrontation was not about punishment, it was about revelation. The act of recognizing the system breaks its invisibility, and once visible, its hold is no longer absolute. Transformation is contagious. Once you see the invisible patterns of obedience, delay, and ritual, they are everywhere. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to question, to reclaim, to reshape. Every "we're busy" becomes a mirror, reflecting centuries of expectation and control. And every choice to act consciously, to refuse automatic compliance, fractures the legacy of passive obedience. By the end of that day, I realized something terrifying and exhilarating. Knowledge changes you permanently. You cannot unsee the architecture of control once you recognize it. You cannot unknow the lessons that have been whispered into your mind since birth, and you cannot return to the passive patterns of waiting, obedience, and automatic submission. You are awake now, and the world, no matter how familiar, feels entirely different. Awakening is not an isolated act. It does not end in a single revelation, a single confrontation, or a single set of papers. It ripples outward, like a stone dropped into still water, touching every aspect of life that had once felt unquestionable. I began to map the patterns I had seen, the invisible structures shaping families, institutions, entire societies, and I realized the personal and the collective are inseparable. Every act of obedience I had observed, every polite delay, every "we're busy" or "wait your turn," was part of a larger design. The same rhythms echo in corporate hierarchies, in legal systems, in bureaucracies, in traditions. The tools are simple: repetition, expectation, subtle reinforcement, and the illusion of consent. The result is absolute. Millions of people operating as if guided by choice, yet silently navigating a path predetermined by patterns they never saw. And this is the terrifying part. The architecture of control is invisible to those who accept it. It is only when someone refuses to comply automatically, when someone steps out of the ritual, that the pattern becomes visible. That is why my accident, my father's text, and my act of bringing the papers were not merely personal, they were symbolic. They demonstrated the fracture point. They revealed how awareness can disrupt centuries of conditioning, how a single conscious act can illuminate the machinery beneath the surface. I realized then that true power lies not in authority or wealth, but in perception. To see the unseen is to reclaim the mind. To recognize the ritual is to step beyond it. To act consciously is to become a force the invisible system cannot anticipate. And yet, awakening is dangerous. It isolates you, because the world around you continues to obey without noticing. It unsettles, because what was once familiar now feels alien. It demands responsibility, because knowing the machinery is only the beginning. You must decide whether to use the knowledge and how. As I walked through the quiet streets that night, I felt both fear and exhilaration. Fear, because the patterns of control are vast, intricate, and resilient. Exhilaration, because I understood the first principle of liberation. Once you see the system, you are no longer bound by it. Every delay, every polite dismissal, every conditioned response can now be examined, challenged, and transcended. The invisible chains are no longer invisible, and the world, no matter how ordinary, has become a labyrinth of conscious choice, and I am awake to navigate it. I began to understand that control is inherited as much as it is imposed. It passes silently from parent to child, from teacher to student, from tradition to generation. Every delay, every polite refusal, every lesson in patience is a thread woven into the fabric of obedience, and yet the inheritance is not inevitable. Awareness can interrupt the lineage. Consciousness can fracture it, choice can rewrite it. The papers I brought that day were more than documents. They were symbols of reclamation. They represented knowledge, recognition, and the courage to confront patterns that had been invisible for centuries. They were a declaration. I will not accept automatic obedience. I will not inherit silence. I will see the patterns and step outside them. And in that act, I realized that liberation is not loud. It is subtle, deliberate, and dangerous. It does not demand rebellion, only clarity. It does not require destruction, only perception. I traced the inheritance further. In the silence of the hospital corridors, I saw fathers trained to defer, mothers trained to excuse, children trained to wait. Every polite dismissal, every instruction framed as for your own good, every ritualized delay, they were all echoes of the same architecture of obedience. And every echo contains a weakness, every ritual contains a crack. Every conditioned act contains a moment of choice. That is where power resides, not in obedience, not in authority, but in the ability to recognize, to act consciously, to refuse the default rhythm. I understood that reclaiming autonomy is not a single act. It is a lifelong excavation, a constant observation, a refusal to surrender the mind to invisible systems. The moment you see, you are no longer passive. The moment you recognize, you begin to navigate, disrupt, and reclaim. The moment you choose, the machinery trembles. And so I carried the weight of this revelation forward, quietly, deliberately. Each day became a test. Would I defer out of habit or act from awareness? Would I obey because it was expected or because it was consciously chosen? Would I allow patterns to repeat, or would I fracture them before they could take hold again? In that tension, I felt the full gravity of liberation. It is dangerous, it is rare, but it is real. And as I left the hospital that evening, I understood the final truth. Freedom is not given. It is recognized, seized, and sustained. It is the product of awareness meeting action, of consciousness confronting centuries of ritual, of a single choice breaking patterns older than memory. I walked out of the hospital that night carrying more than papers. I carried knowledge, clarity, and a responsibility I had never asked for. The accident, the text, the waiting, the forms, they had all been initiation, not punishment, not cruelty, not chance. Initiation, a gateway into the hidden rhythms that govern human life, the silent architecture of obedience, and the inherited patterns that pass unnoticed through generations. I realized that my father, like everyone else, was both victim and participant. The same forces that guided his decisions guided mine, guided yours. The difference is awareness. To see the unseen is to begin reclaiming authority over your life. To witness the machinery is to fracture its invisibility. And to act consciously is to declare that you will no longer inherit the silent chains without question. The world around you, the polite delays, the whispered refusals, the structured waiting rooms of life, is neither kind nor cruel. It is just a reflection of patterns that have endured for millennia. Civilizations, families, institutions, all are governed by the same invisible forces, and the only way to step outside them is to see them, understand them, and act deliberately. I am not telling you this to scare you. I am telling you because knowledge is dangerous. It changes perception, alters identity, and awakens a vigilance. Most people never experience. Once you see the patterns, you cannot unsee them. Once you recognize the rhythm of obedience, you cannot resume life as if it were natural. You must act consciously, because the machinery will always try to resume its course. The accident, the text, the papers, they were not endings, they were beginnings. They were a call to see the unseen, to challenge the automatic, to reclaim the mind, the body, and the will. And the power you feel when you recognize these rhythms is not fleeting. It is permanent, because awareness cannot be erased. It is dangerous, because once awakened, you will never accept control without question. And it is liberating, because you now see the invisible and can walk differently through the world. So remember this, the patterns of obedience are all around you, in every waiting room, every office, every home. They are centuries old, but they are fragile. And you, once awake, are the fracture point. You are the observer, the disruptor, the one who will navigate the labyrinth consciously, refusing to inherit what was never meant to bind you. The question is no longer, why did they wait? The question is, will you see the unseen, or will you continue to obey by default?